Hi, I'm Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research. I'm joined today by Gabriel Mckee, a writer, librarian, and curator at NYU. He holds master's degrees in Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School and in Library and Information Science from Long Island University. His latest book is The Saucerian: UFOs, Men in Black, and the Unbelievable Life of Gray Barker. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks.
Before we get into the details and the many interesting aspects of the mid 20th century UFO community and Gray Barker's involvement in it, could you please summarize for us who was Gray Barker and what did he do?
Yeah, he's not a household name. It's definitely somebody that people in the know, know a lot about him, and everybody else knows nothing. So he was very active in the early flying saucer community, and I use flying saucer kind of in order to be non-anachronistic, because that was actually the technical term in the late 40s and early 50s for what later became known as UFOs. He founded one of the first flying saucer zines in 1953 called the Saucerian, and a few years later he spun that into a publishing imprint that called Saucerian Books, which published dozens of flying saucer books and zines for the next 30 years. So he was a really kind of foundational figure in the study, investigation, communication, and fandom, which is a term I use very deliberately, of flying saucers.
Right, thank you. And I gather from reading your book that although he's not a household name, he had a lot of influence on the narratives that went around the UFO community. Is that correct? Or the flying saucer community?
Yes, definitely, and certainly it was called UFOs, within a few years of him getting started. So we can I kind of use them interchangeably after a certain point. Uh, so yes, he was very influential. He was a lot of the stories that he published went on to some renown and kind of pop up here and there over the decades. Probably the most famous one is the Men in Black, which is a story that he kind of inaugurated with his first book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was published in 1956, and told the story of his friend and colleague Albert K. Bender in the International Flying Saucer Bureau, which was Bender's group, and how a group of three men in dark suits convinced Bender to shut this group down and end his investigation of UFOs. And so that kind of set the template for similar stories and stories that were not so similar, but they get framed as similar stories over the next few decades, and kind of started that whole ball rolling.
One of the things that stood out to me about this era and Barker as well was it was my understanding we were getting somewhat of a divide in the early to mid 1950s of you had your nuts and bolts guys that wanted to somehow incorporate science and at least use the terminology into their investigations and writing, while the contactee movement was rising. And that took on a whole spiritualistic, all kinds of other avenues. And it seems that Barker, am I interpreting correctly that he just wanted to go with what was popular and he was as good with a contactee story as any other story?
Yeah, he did a real good job in the first few years of his zine of if not being one of the nuts and bolts people, of convincing the nuts and bolts people that he was on their side. And so in that very early period, you see a lot of kind of mutually appreciative correspondence between him and people like the members of CSI, Civilian Saucer Intelligence, which was one of the nuts and bolts groups in New York, and later became a NICAP affiliate. Yeah, they got along well for a little while, but they turned on him quite a bit over the way that he covered contactee stories. For Barker, yeah, he was interested in what the audience wanted, and he determined that the audience wanted the weirdest stories and the stories that were most about extraterrestrial life and things like that. And in the early 50s, that was the contactees. But what I learned in studying this period is that it's not so clean cut a division as it might at first appear. There's actually a lot of cross pollination between the two groups. A lot of people who would later say they had always been against George Adamski, who in fact sponsored lectures by him and things like that. So there was definitely a sense in a lot of the flying saucer world that any story about flying saucers was part of the same kind of large narrative. And I think Barker really embodies that in a lot of ways, even though he got kind of cast out over it within a few years.
And funding issues. Like I know that in NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, Kehoe talked a good game about science, but he had some contributors that were very interested in Adamski and the contactees, and that has to be taken into consideration. And along with the cross pollination, I think too we had all of the or many of the social dynamics we still see today. That there were investigators and writers and publishers that would pay some lip service to journalistic ethics, yet like it struck me that you wrote about, I think it was a message from Ray Palmer, who was writing to Barker that he was concerned about, I forget the exact story, but that he didn't want to go with this one angle because it's what people were doing that weren't really wanting to report the truth. And that just struck me as humorous coming from Ray Palmer,
Yeah.
all things considered. So, talk some, please, about those dynamics that you have people that are giving lip service to research integrity. You have people that were practicing integrity, and then you had people like Barker that were kind of working both ends in the middle, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, yeah. I think the main difference between Barker and a lot of the people that were a little more dedicated to appearing serious and sober and scientific was that he never really tried to present himself as anything other than a storyteller. So what you see in his books is very often he'll be kind of manipulating narratives. He'll be like taking kind of cherry picking details to make something kind of fit into the type of story that he's trying to tell. And that made him kind of a scapegoat where people could point at him and say, oh, well, he's not being serious with the facts. But in fact, this is something that we find that all of the authors in this field do. And not just in this field, and many others as well. That Kehoe in particular faced some criticism from people in the 50s for the fact that he was really kind of framing his interactions with the Air Force in a way to maximize the mystery. And that's somebody who was very respected by a lot of the kind of more sober what would later be called ufologists. And so in Gray Barker's book, The Silver Bridge, which was published in 1970, he has a chapter where there's a character named the Recorder. And it's a very strange kind of poetic chapter, but I think it's kind of the key to his entire career and all of his writing. And this is a character who is described as manipulating the events that he's witnessing, and reporting on. That he doesn't just report the facts. He actually will change someone's name or move them from one place to another, using what's presented in this chapter as kind of a magical ability. But what he's really saying with this chapter is that the people that report and write about these things are changing the story to make it something that's going to keep the audience engaged. Throughout the 50s and 60s, what you see is a kind of building tolerance for narratives. I saw a light in the sky, and it didn't seem like a plane, and it disappeared. Is not a really interesting story by 1957 or 1958, and so even that early, people are looking for the stories that are weirder, and that maybe involve, was there a being that emerged from this thing that you saw, or was there some kind of strange effect on your sense of reality or your perceptions, beyond just seeing something that you didn't know what it was. And that kind of rising tolerance is what keeps the audience engaged. And so that's something that Barker was very aware of and kind of consciously played into. And in that book, The Silver Bridge, he pulls back the curtain and says, "This is what I'm doing, but it's what all these other authors are doing too."
I see. Thank you. Now, backing up a little bit to the area, West Virginia, it became home of the Mothman saga. An angle you took in your book that I always appreciate professional research and its presentation. So thank you for that. You also delved into the history of the area, the Braxton County, and how that history may have played into the evolution of its people and their beliefs. Would you talk some about that, please? As I thought that was a quite interesting section.
Yeah, so Barker was born and raised in Braxton County, West Virginia, right in the geographic center of the state, a pretty remote area. He grew up on small, essentially subsistence farm, where his family, had some cows and chickens, and that was what most of the families in the area did. It was very sparsely populated, and he talks in some of his letters about his childhood. And what comes across in those letters is that storytelling was a really important part of his upbringing. And I think this is the case for a lot of people in West Virginia. It's a place with a really rich tradition of folklore. And a lot of the stories that he recalls in these letters involve weird events. Some of them may be, supernatural encounters, and some of them may be pranks. But he presents them all in the same tone, and that's something that he does in his published writing as well, where he does not necessarily distinguish between a true story and a hoax, even the hoaxes that he engaged in himself, because it is the storytelling that is the thing. That's the hook for him, of that kind of interpersonal reaction, that encounter. What happens between me and you when I tell you a story, and that's really the thing that mattered to him, and I think the reason that he got involved in and stayed involved in UFO book writing and publishing for so long. But yeah, it's a really interesting and beautiful place. So definitely worth visiting sometime if you can. So the sighting that kind of put him on the map, the report that put him on the map, was the Flatwoods Monster encounter in 1952, which happened just a few miles from where he grew up. So it was essentially in his hometown. He grew up in Riffle and Exchange, which are just north of Sutton, West Virginia. Flatwoods is northeast, so it was kind of the valley town next to the hill that he grew up on, essentially. Yeah, definitely a place that was close to home for him. His relationship with West Virginia, and particularly the kind of rural areas that he grew up in, is a little fraught in some places. You can kind of see in some of his writing that it's an important place to him, and a place that he feels like he understands, but not necessarily a place that he likes. And he actually says some kind of mean and cruel things about about some of the people that live in some of the more remote areas, like the one he grew up in. And so it's a little tough to know if he's kind of trying to take his hometown down a peg in some places. But it's definitely a place that had a really big influence on him. And he lived his entire life in West Virginia. He lived mostly in Clarksburg, which is a bigger city in the northern part of the state. But he did return to Braxton County for the last few years of his life.
Right, right. So he grew up in that area. He appreciated the stories. He became a talented storyteller. He seems to have been intelligent, I gather from your work.
Definitely,
He,
yeah.
yeah, he was entrepreneurial and he was talented at marketing, right? Like with the theater business and whatnot.
Yeah, so he started a movie booking company, which he would at times call the largest theatrical booking agency in West Virginia, which he would then footnote by saying it was the only theatrical booking agency in West Virginia. But he got his start in promotion for mostly drive-in theaters. So this is in the late 40s, early 50s. There was this huge boom in the construction of drive-ins because all you needed was land and a little money to put up a screen, and you can own a movie theater. But what a lot of these theater owners found is that you also need to know how to operate a movie theater, and none of them knew how. So he kind of saw that as an opportunity where he would kind of come in and, in some cases, just kind of handle the what movies they were going to show and arrange the rentals of those. In other cases, he would just manage the theater for them, all for a fee. But he had at one point almost 40 clients, and so this was a job that required a lot of hustle, a lot of driving around in the hillside regions of West Virginia and Western Pennsylvania. And so it took up a lot of his time. And so during the spring and summer months, he was working probably 12, 16-hour days most of the time to handle all of his clients. But then in the winter months, he would have a lot more free time, and that's when he did most of his saucer writing and publishing.
And he started um, zines, send newsletters. They would send them out by mail. Pretty much start with just pretty much their friends and whose addresses they had. I really loved the Moseley line, the James Moseley, that he said something to the effect of, I wanted to become an item among all of the high profile UFO people. So insulting them seemed to be a means to that end.
Yeah. So Jim Moseley was Barker's best friend for most of his life. They met in 1954. And Moseley was a Princeton dropout with a trust fund who said for years he was working on a UFO book, which he never actually wrote or published. But he did found a zine, which eventually is probably best known as Saucer News, though it continued as Saucer Smear until 2012 when he died. So he was a very long-running figure in the UFO scene. And yeah, he really did start out as somebody who saw this as a pot that he could stir. He wanted to make a name for himself as quickly as possible and saw starting feuds and setting people off against each other as a good way to do it. So I did a lot of archival research for this project, mostly in the Gray Barker archive, which is at the Clarksburg Harrison Public Library. A lot of the stuff on Moseley that I found that was kind of most entertaining was actually in the New York Public Library, which has the papers of Ted Blocher, who was a member of CSI, that New York-based organization. And seeing what Blocher wrote about Moseley in the time, where they kind of start out seeing him as a friend, somebody who's on the side of the scientific approach, and then they just get increasingly frustrated with with his approach and how many fights he seems to be starting. But it worked for Moseley. He ended up having one of the highest kind of circulation figures of any flying saucer publication in the 60s.
Now, during this time as well, while he's operating the movie promotion business and the writing semi successfully, you document how he was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and you document from archival research and various means, letters, that he seemed to have an attraction to underage males. How do your readers and people integrate this into their assessment of Graybark?
Yeah, so this is something I wanted to approach really carefully in the book, and so I definitely do urge you to like look at the footnotes in that section. I did a lot of reading in queer history, and particularly in the kind of history of how gay men in particular and the struggles that they faced with the law in the 50s and 60s. So there's a great book called The Boys of Boise. It's about a moral panic over kind of gay sexual activity in a small town, not unlike Clarksburg. So that is a good one. And there is, I'm going to pause for a second and bring up a scholar's name.
Take your time.
Yeah, because I want to get it right. So there is a historian of gay literature named Rachel Hope Cleaves, who has written a lot about this. She has an article called "The Problem of Modern Pederasty in Queer History," and that it really looks at this particular issue. And so that research really guided my approach in a lot of ways. But what I found was a really important thing to do with this was to contextualize it, both in terms of what was going on in America at the time, in terms of how the prosecutions against gay men were handled, but also the kind of narrower context of what was going on in Clarksburg at that time. And so I looked at the kind of ways that sexuality was treated legally, and the fact that there was a discrepancy where straight people who were involved in kind of intergenerational relationships would not face the same kind of penalties that gay people would. But even more narrowly, with Gray Barker and his partner Don Lee McCulty, they were arrested at the same time and tried together for separate acts with different people. So Barker's charge was contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and he faced a very mild penalty, essentially probation. Don Lee McCulty was charged with consensual sexual activity with an adult, and he faced a significantly harsher penalty. He was actually institutionalized for a number of months. And so the law in Clarksburg was not telling him that the problem was the age of his partners. It was just telling him that it was their sex. And that consent was not really an issue for them, and that's why McCulty faced a harsher penalty. So for Barker, what I found was that he really viewed, I think, the gay community in Clarksburg, which we're kind of led to believe is not something that exists. But he there was one, and he was part of it, and it was important to him. So we see in some of his letters this kind of tapestry of queer life in Clarksburg that is kind of hidden between the lines of official history. Barker, I think, was interested in the world of UFOs and the world of contactees in particular, because he saw it as a world of outsiders. And I think that was something that he felt a lot of affinity for. And I think that is related not just to his sexuality, but I think that is a part of it. And so that's the kind of the context that I kind of want to see his sexuality in.
That's interesting because I was struck as well by this did not prove to be as financially advantageous for him as other aspects of his life, the businesses he was running and things like that. Yet he's stuck with it. And I have often observed in today's fringe communities, UFO communities, that they seem to get kind of addicted to the argument or addicted to the search, or they just like to write. They like to write about this. How much do you think that played into it? We John Keel's a good example of it's just what he did, you know. And how much of that do you think was going on with Gray Barker and his closer friends as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So certainly, I think I don't think he ever thought he was going to find an answer. I don't think after a certain point he thought there was an answer to find. And for one thing, if you answer the flying saucer mystery, there are no more stories to tell. And I think that is, akin to death for Gray Barker. You do see him returning to a lot of the same stories and resuscitating the stories. The Flatwoods Monster was his first case. One of the last issues of Gray Barker's newsletter has as its cover story this kind of very crude crayon drawing of a very similar monster that he was reporting had been seen in Pennsylvania, and so this kind of reviving that kind of narrative, and it's the one of the reasons he keeps coming back to Men in Black stories as well. So one of his final books is MIB: The Secret Terror Among Us. Um, in one of his editorials in the 70s, he's kind of presenting the Bender story yet again. And he's kind of open-heartedly talking about what he really believes. And towards the end, he says, Bender still has me by the Saucerian balls. And this was highlighted to me as maybe meaning, this is the story that he still feels there's a mystery to explore. But I thought about it some more and realized it could mean the opposite. It could mean this is a story that I've been telling for so long that I can't stop telling it. This story has its hook in me, not in the sense that I think I can solve it or that there is a solution out there, but in the sense that it is a tale that I have become so thoroughly a character in that I can't, if I stop being that character, then I stop, not the story stops. And so I thought that was a really, really interesting line about I don't know if pathology is the right word of UFO writing and publishing for him in particular, but certainly the dynamic that he felt he was involved in.
Yeah, and sometimes you just get interested, like saucers or not, what happened? Why did this person behave the way they did? Would you please summarize the Albert Bender story for those that don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau, which was one of the first civilian saucer groups. This was in about 1952, when there was beginning to be a lot of impatience among the really interested people in the country over waiting for an official answer about what flying saucers were. And so you had a number of groups start up that said, we're going to assemble the data and find the answer for ourselves. And so this is when you see groups like APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, um, and groups like that starting up. So the IFSB is one of the very first. It actually does live up to its name eventually because it does have members in Canada, in Australia. And so it is truly international. And Bender really loved handing out titles, so he made Barker the West Virginia representative after I think only one letter, and then very shortly after that appointed him head of the investigations committee, purely on the strength of the three-page article that he had written for Fate magazine on the Flatwoods Monster. So definitely not necessarily checking people's credentials, as investigators, because this was not something that Barker had any kind of background or training in. Um, but then, just about a month after Barker published the first issue of the Saucerian, Bender sent him a letter saying, don't sign up any more members for the group. You're going to have to wait and see what's in the next newsletter. And that newsletter included a statement that the IFSB was shutting down because the flying saucer mystery had been discovered, or the solution to the flying saucer mystery had been uncovered, but could not be revealed. The story that his colleagues in the investigation committee eventually dragged out of Bender was that he had been visited by three men in dark suits who had some information that he had mailed to one of his correspondents. Which correspondent and what information is the primary mystery for Barker because no one ever found out what that exactly was. Um, but over the course of about an hour, this group of three men convinced him to shut down the IFSB and stop all saucer research. And so this was a group that was fairly successful, was growing pretty rapidly in this period. And so Barker and his friends, or at least as Barker reports it, were shocked by all of this and really wanted to get to the bottom of what had happened to Al Bender. So that became the fodder for Barker's first book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, and became a mystery, capital M, that he would return to for years to come.
Sure, absolutely. If your associate just says, I'm out and I can't tell you anymore, I'm just not talking about it, of course that would pique your interest to say the least. But with Barker, you're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, yeah, but did the guy really say this, or does Barker just say he says it? And then that's where you do the work of trying to sort through that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And this was kind of a lot of the archival work was, if there was a story that Barker reported in a published place, I wanted to find the letters and documents from around the stated dates to back it up and see what was different, what was the same. In a lot of cases, what he reports is extremely, accurate to what's in the documents. In some cases, it's not. And very often, what's not accurate is the thing that he's hiding in a lot of cases is that he knows what happened because it was a prank that he had pulled. And in print, he's only presenting the mystery that he had created and not the solution that he was behind it.
Right. And you likened his tactics to Barnum and Bailey, and that they would take this I'm just saying approach. Like, I'm just giving you the story. You have to come check it out and see what's true, what's not. Like, challenge the skeptics even to take it and play with it and pass it around, and in doing so make it popular.
Yeah, I read a couple books on Barnum, and one of them was Kevin Young's Bunk, which is about it's about kind of hucksters and hoaxsters in American culture very broadly, but really focuses on P.T. Barnum. And what fascinated me is that people think of P.T. Barnum as somebody who just played a lot of hoaxes and told people that something was true that wasn't. But that's not actually what he did at all. He would always present it as a question and say, is this really, is this Fiji mermaid really an unknown creature? And you have to come and see it for yourself so that you can find the answer. So he's kind of making the audience into the person that's going to decide what's real and what's not. And when I read that in Kevin Young's book, I realized that that's exactly what Barker is doing in all of, particularly his advertising writing for the books he published. He's saying like, did Dr. Raymond Bernard vanish into the inner earth? Question mark. There's always the question mark at the end of these statements in that writing. And so he's trying to hook the audience so that even those who think it's ridiculous are going to want to read it so that they can be the one to make that determination. He lays this out really clearly in one of his very early advertising serials where he says, this book is going to do something to you. And he lists 10 possible responses. This is the answer to the flying saucer mystery at the top, all the way down to this is a complete hoax and it's stupid. But whatever it does, it's going to do something to you and you need to read it to have that experience. And I thought it was great that he kind of just so clearly laid out what his approach to publishing was in that.
Yeah, yeah. And that that tendency to want to get involved with the other writers. There was this community, and they would write back and forth. And then I I think I had a cursory knowledge of Barker before reading your book. I think that people would largely associate him with some peripheral part of the Mothman story.
Yeah.
I did. I knew that he and Moseley had been involved in some kind of funny business with John Keel, and so I appreciated you addressing that. Over the years, people I've known that knew Keel would politely imply he was a pretty good storyteller himself, that his real talent was writing. He could really present that stuff. But then he seemed to even take issue with the extent Barker took it, as well as tell us what you think was relevant about the John Keel Gray Barker
Ooh,
interactions.
that they are intertwined for so long that it's that it's kind of tough to summarize. But I will give it a shot. So yeah, so John Keel and Barker first met in late 1966 when they were both investigating the Mothman, but also the Woodrow Derenberger contact case, which was occurring around the same time. And at least as I was able to interpret from the available documents, they actually met for the first time while they were interviewing Derenberger. They essentially went to his house together. I think they had corresponded and made this arrangement that they would kind of joint interview him. Um, and what's interesting is that there's a kind of bit of prank war that ensues, and it's Keel that started it. You would kind of think it might be Barker, but while they were doing this kind of Ohio River investigation, I'm sorry, Keel wrote out a fake note from the Men in Black, a threatening note saying like "We warned you," and slid it under Barker's door, thinking that, over breakfast the next day they would have a chuckle over it and move on. And Keel was shocked to find a few months later that Barker had published this as an authentic threat from the MIB in one of his zines. Um, and so he said, "How could you do this? You knew that was just a joke I was playing on you, right?" And the note itself, or at least something that I believe is the note, is actually still in Barker's files, which is fantastic
And
in
when
the
you
MIB
kind of
folders.
think about it, it's like, well, of course he published it.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we're doing. We're creating stories that we can then tell in print. And so yeah, they did become very associated over the Mothman thing in 66 and 67. Barker, of course, is essentially a character in the Mothman prophecies. But The Silver Bridge, which was Barker's book about the same events that the Mothman prophecies is about, came out about 5 years earlier. And Keel, of course, is a character in that as well. And there's a chapter called The Man with the Beard. Some of the UFO bibliographies out there will tell you that Keel wrote that chapter himself. What I determined, I wish I could find the original draft of the chapter. Does not seem to have survived, but Keel gave Barker some language to replace a couple sections. So it is mostly still Barker's work. But then when Keel starts explaining his own beliefs in that chapter, that's kind of where Keel takes over. Um, but by the late 60s, early 70s, Keel was kind of trying to present himself as being a scientific ufologist, which is not, I don't think that's something that he really stuck with for very long, but certainly in Operation Trojan Horse, his kind of primary UFO book, he is really using a lot of the same language that a lot of the scientific ufologists of the day were using, where he's saying, "I'm assembling data and turning it into valid statistical form," and he uses phrases like this. But of course, that's not what he's doing. He is telling stories and coming up with interpretations of those stories and finding ways to massage stories into those interpretations. Exactly what Barker was saying in The Silver Bridge is what UFO authors do. Um, but yes, so throughout the late 60s, though, kind of the chapter in the Mothman prophecies where Keel is describing all of the strange stuff that happened to him over the phone, which includes what I think is kind of one of the most chilling stories in that book, is a strange phone call from someone who calls themselves Gray Barker, but cannot possibly be Gray Barker because he doesn't know things Gray would know. He's talking in this strange robotic voice. If you look at Keel's notes, which are available at johnkeel.com, made available by Doug Skinner, who keeps Keel's archive, he has his notes from the day after he got that phone call, and he calls it the Gray Barker hoax. He knows that it was a prank that was being played on him. But Barker, responded to a letter saying, "It's strange. I have no memory of giving you a phone call, but I looked at my phone bill and there is a call to you. This is a weird mystery. Maybe you can figure it out." So he makes it a mystery for Keel to explore. And over the next few years, Keel convinces himself that this really was something strange and inexplicable. Um, and it's really only one part of a whole bunch of phone stuff that he's describing in that chapter, which includes a lot of weird beeps. Keel and Moseley were known for making prank calls to people with
You
things
mean
like
Barker and Moseley?
yeah, sorry. Barker and Moseley were known for making prank calls to people that would have strange beeping noises in them. In fact, I found out recently exactly what was making the beeping noise. It was a telegraph tapper that one of their associates had given to Barker. They would record things and play them back because Barker had, a tape recorder that he would use. And so a lot of the strange phone things that are happening are almost certainly prank calls from either Gray Barker, Jim Moseley, or the two of them together, or in many cases, a third party that they had put up to it. And that really, that's the prank war against Keel that I was kind of talking about. I think Barker had kind of identified Keel as a good mark, somebody that was kind of maybe a little earnest and was willing to believe a lot of things on a little bit of evidence. And he thought, well, this is somebody I can give a real experience to. The unfortunate thing of that is if you read those notes kind of day to day through that Doug Skinner's made available, you kind of see Keel kind of spinning out of control in 67, 68, and kind of going to the brink of madness in a lot of ways, I think. And if that was a result of pranks that Barker was playing on him, I think that's kind of one of the more maybe questionable things that he did. On the other hand, Keel knew what to do. He spun it into the mythology of the Mothman prophecies that has been very, influential and has had a long life. And if those pranks hadn't been, quite as convincing, maybe that book wouldn't have been as good. So,
It was indeed one of the more captivating parts of the Mothman Prophecies book. Yes. Um, in reading between the lines a little bit here, it's not difficult to see where investigators and writers, editors in the UFO community, the flying saucer genre in the 50s and 60s, may have not had a lot of appreciation for a trust fund guy that's riding around just entertaining himself and causing trouble, and Barker's antics. One can see where some of them might have gotten a bit fed up with it. I dearly love Moseley's writing. I mean, I can go into a saucer smear archive and entertain myself for untold amounts of time just reading and following the stories.
yeah, there was a big kind of push against covering the world of flying saucers instead of covering flying saucers themselves among those serious and sober ufologists. And Barker and Moseley both were very much interested in the personalities. For somebody who is interested in the culture, which is really what I, am studying, uh, Moseley and Barker both are, a gold mine because they are talking about exactly the thing that I think is most interesting, which is the people and the personalities.
Yeah, and Moseley was talented at
Yeah,
presenting it too. He
definitely.
was, and it was entertaining to read in addition to just A, B, C, D happen, which I find myself challenged. I often just lay it out where Moseley, yeah, he was talented at I can see why he offended them. I
Yeah.
mean, it was different. It really wasn't that offensive if you could take a joke, but it was very offensive compared to the sober, scientific, this is a big deal. Like, I don't think a lot of people today understand that saucer culture in the 50s, a lot of it was built around, am I correct? In my assessment, a lot of it was built around this is new and the interplanetary beings are here and it's just all going to break any day.
Yeah, which sounds very familiar to anyone who's been paying attention to UFO stuff in the last 5 or 10 years, which I have to admit I don't pay a lot of attention to. My interest drops off pretty hard after the late '80s, maybe early '90s, and it's one of the reasons is because it does tend to be a lot of the same stories and the same interpretations and the same approaches, and there isn't that much new under the sun. But yeah, certainly there was a big focus on novelty. Is a way that I kind of want to say that. You want to be reporting the latest sightings, but also, I was talking earlier about the kind of tolerance that builds up novelty in another way as well. Of this is a story that you haven't heard before. I'm going to tell you a story that's different than the 50 sightings that we talked about in the last year. And so finding the way that to tell a new story is really what keeps that culture going.
Right, right. Yes, it does. And it requires turning over an audience, like they can't have that edge of their seat excitement if they're aware of this 75-year history. So it keeps requiring newer audiences, unless, like you say, you're a student of the culture itself. And I share your fascination with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that you see, and this is something that continues down to the present, I think, is the kind of rehabilitation of stories that were rejected out of hand before. And so, like one example is contactee stories, which people like George Adamski were basically just thought to be hucksters in the 1950s by a lot of the people that really took a serious approach to the UFO mystery. Um, and this is just somebody who's in it for the money and is making up this story. Um, and then later on, when you see abductee stories starting to emerge in the 60s and 70s, this is they end up being very similar in a lot of ways to some of the contactee stories in a way that's often overlooked. But a lot of people in on the kind of Barker side of the UFO world describe these as contact stories. That he describes Betty Hill as a contactee. He describes Travis Walton as a contactee. And this is something Jim Moseley called Betty Hill a contactee, into the '90s. But if you look really closely, not just at Betty Hill's story, but on Betty Hill as a person and what she, kind of her ideas about the space people in the '80s and '90s, she sounds an awful lot like a 1960s contactee. The aliens are my friends and they, beam messages to me and things like that. These are stories that she tells too. And so being aware of the overlap and the kind of similarity between those is important. More recently, you start to see those contactee stories get rehabilitated again with now, okay, it wasn't people from Venus, but it was the CIA, it was part of MK Ultra, and there's this kind of they've instituted the government and security agencies as the supernatural, all-powerful force that was behind these narratives, and so those stories end up getting rehabilitated as well, with a different interpretation, a different meta narrative now.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes we just change the perpetrator as we keep going through them. And you address some of the contactees in your book, and it's also a very real situation for the FBI and that Red Scare during the time, that a lot of these contactees were getting a movement behind them that was seen by what arguably was a too far right leaning Edgar Hoover and FBI, as they would equate peace activism with communist behavior.
Yeah, exactly. This is the height of McCarthyism when these contactee stories are coming out. So my colleague Aaron Gullius, who does the podcast The Saucer Life, has written something that I haven't read yet, but I'm in the book that it's going to be published in as well. I believe later this year. Has written kind of investigation of the Detroit Flying Saucer Club and the FBI's investigation into it, which had nothing to do with the reality of the Space Brothers, and was entirely about are the Space Brothers Soviet agents, and the idea that if a contactee is speaking to a group and talking about free love or the economic system on Venus and how great it is, they really want to know does the economic system on Venus look like communism? Because that might be a problem for for the FBI. And so there are cases where the government did take an active interest in these stories, but as far as I've been able to ascertain, it was entirely about either, is this a communist infiltration that we need to be worrying about, or is this person claiming to be a representative of the government when in fact they're not, which was one of the things that George Adamski got in hot water for, saying that the FBI had approved his message, in which they took to be, one step shy of impersonating a federal agent.
Absolutely. FBI files likewise indicate Ray Palmer got paid a visit at one point,
Yes.
getting urged to leave the FBI out of his stories to
Yeah.
give them credibility.
Yeah.
Yes, that was Hoover was not a fan of using the FBI as an endorsement of the saucer stories.
Yeah.
No.
And the first time I was able to find Gray Barker turning up on the FBI's radar was when people started writing letters asking, hey, I've just read this book. They knew too much about flying saucers. Is the FBI trying to silence civilian investigation of UFOs? And there's a letter saying, like, what is this book? Go get us a copy so that we can find out what it says. And that's the earliest reference to Gray Barker in any government document I was able to find.
Sure, sure. And like you say, all of the references that I've come across, Kehoe, all of these are concerns that it's communist influenced or not. Maybe they're not even particularly concerned about that in all cases as much as they really don't care where it came from if it's FBI bashing, and
Yeah.
when you start conducting a campaign against the United States Air Force, that gets on the radar of intelligence agencies like, what's this guy doing? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so back to Gray Barker. He's had these run-ins now with Keel, and it's a tumultuous relationship. Keel's written him and said, that Derringer interview, I'll remind you I was there. That's not what happened. Yeah. And so now,
Yeah, the sentence he uses is, "It's not very accurate, Gray."
yeah, I think we might need to look at that. Yeah. Okay. So as the 60s wind on, how did the community change, and how did Barker try to respond to it?
Yeah, so in the later 60s, you see a kind of movement emerge, and Keel is really part of it, called middle ufology. And that kind of presents itself as being the middle ground. But then you have to ask, well, the middle ground between what? And the two sides are the nuts and bolts people and the contactees. And they are saying, we're the middle ground between these two things. But what that actually ends up meaning is that it's kind of really tangential to either of them. That's where you see interpretations of fourth dimensional and fifth dimensional beings. So Keel's ultra terrestrials are very much a part of this. Things like time travel and other weirder explanations for not just UFOs but all manner of paranormal and other phenomena. And so Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia is a major part of this. People like Alan Greenfield, who's very active in the magical practice community, are a big part of this. And Gray ends up being associated with this in a lot of ways. So he is, but he's a bit more of an impish figure. So he doesn't ever really publicly state that he believes any of these interpretations. But he was very willing to present them. Um, so the National UFO Congress was one of the groups that kind of was one of the annual meeting places for this, and he was involved with that. And that ended up being influential, but I think Barker's role in it is downplayed a lot because none of his books really appear middle ufological in too clear a way. But I think his approach very much is, and I think read through the right lens, I think the Silver Bridge is very much a part of that. And Alan Greenfield actually wrote the introduction to the Silver Bridge, not just the more recently published edition that you can get on Amazon, but to the original edition as well. He wrote a introduction that Gray Barker cut about half of because he said that Greenfield was basically giving the game away. He was making it too
Interesting.
clear what Barker was doing in the book and the way that it's not a book about the Mothman and UFOs, but is very much a book about storytelling. And Barker cut that because I think he wanted readers to figure that out themselves, or maybe just wanted readers to be puzzled. Uh, and not know what to make of it. But I think he wanted people to figure out what he was doing if they really thought about it enough. I had to read the book 3 times before I really understood what was going on in it. So
Interesting. And so, and tell us about Barker's later life and how he never did let go of it, did
no, no, he slowed down his publishing at a few points in his career. So he had declared bankruptcy in the early 60s, which slowed him down for a little while, but he came back. He slowed down again in the 70s. And did not put out too many more what we might consider major books after his reissue of the Vero edition of The Case for the UFO by Morris K. Jessup, which is a very long and complicated story related to the Philadelphia experiment and the Allende letters. But I don't know if we need to get into any of that tonight because they're all very complicated stories. But his reissue of that was kind of the last book that made any kind of impact, I would say. So he launched a new newsletter in the 70s called Gray Barker's Newsletter, which started out kind of as a corner stapled zine and ended up being like a big tabloid newspaper kind of thing. He was always playing with new print technologies. And so he was a very early adopter of the personal computer. And in his last few years, he retired from the movie theater he'd been managing. And that led to a massive increase, not in the number of printed books that he published, but certainly in the number of titles he published. So earlier he would publish, 4,000 copies of a book. By the early 80s, he's publishing maybe a couple dozen. But he puts out a large number of different titles in these small editions. And he's laying these out on his computer. He's printing them on essentially a dot matrix printer on the cheapest paper stock that he can afford, and he's binding them with plastic comb bindings. He's got his nephews helping him out with the printing and binding. And so it becomes this very home-based DIY publishing imprint, which is how he had started out on zines in the 50s. And so it was kind of a return to the way he had done things before. Think he put a lot of love into those books that he put out in the last few years, but he did not have a very big audience anymore. A lot of his customer base was people who had been interested in contactees in the 50s. And at the time, a lot of people who were really interested in flying saucers are teenagers in the 50s and 60s. A lot of the people who were interested in contactees were older women, housewives. It was a much more kind of female coded area of the UFO world. But that meant because they were older, a lot of them had died off by the early 80s and hadn't been replaced by new readers. So he definitely had a dwindling customer base. And that was kind of but he wanted to continue giving them the stories that they wanted to read. So he was still very active in publishing right up to his death in 1984.
he? And it's fittingly not clear how he died, right?
Not entirely. So Jim Moseley voices the theory in his book, Shockingly Close to the Truth, his memoir, and in, I believe, both of the documentaries about Gray Barker, Whispers from Space and Shades of Gray, all three of which are excellent sources for Barker's life and definitely worth tracking down. Um, Moseley has the theory that Barker died of AIDS. And his main evidence for this is, well, nobody in West Virginia knew what AIDS was. I think that Moseley is wrong about that for a couple reasons. And after talking to a few people that knew him, including his niece, who settled his estate and was the one that talked to the doctor, in the hospital after he died, it really looks like he died of a combination of lung disease and possibly liver disease, or some kind of, or I'm sorry, he died of a combination of lung disease and heart disease, which was the result of being a lifelong smoker and a fairly heavy drinker. And those, I think, are enough of an explanation. Uh, Moreover, the hospital where he died was in Charleston, West Virginia. It had an AIDS ward, and he was not in it. So this Moseley's kind of assumption that nobody in West Virginia knew is, I think, false. And so I think we need to take that story with a grain of salt. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's not a necessary explanation. And also, I think but it's fitting, I think, that Barker's death remains a bit of a mystery, that we have these kind of two possible explanations. Um,
Yes, yes. And I somehow have a sneaking suspicion that James Moseley would find it hilarious that we're talking about him in the context of what should be a Gray Barker story. But wait, there's James Moseley,
he's
as
got to
if
have the
that
last
may have
word.
been some of his intent. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, Moseley became a really important part of keeping Barker's legacy alive. And so he would continue to talk about Barker in Saucer Smear, for years to come. He published a really kind of definitely well worth reading obituary right after Barker died. I think he was the first person to report it. Published some of Barker's poetry over the next few years, and then his book, Shockingly Close to the Truth, was the closest thing available until now to a Gray Barker biography, because that book is almost as much about Barker's career as it is about Moseley's.
For those unaware, yeah, I mean, of Moseley's work and Saucer Smear, like you mentioned, Gabriel, that there was kind of a movement to let's not cover the UFO people, just the stories and the saucers. There definitely is a certain oppression, especially of the bad stuff, that like under some guise of it doesn't help the disclosure movement, or it doesn't help the publicity, like we're as if we're doing some kind of movement to get the word out or something like that. And oftentimes, with the more seedy side of things, inappropriate behavior by investigators and things like that, I found that Moseley's Saucer Smear was among the better sources in chronological order of laying
Yeah,
out what happened.
you
Yeah.
can see it unfold, and he will not just attack somebody in print. He's going to give them the chance to respond, and so you can really see both sides. And yeah, Moseley was really masterful at insulting people, but some of the people he insulted were could give as well as they got. So in fact, the correspondence between Moseley and Keel, who did not like each other, is really entertaining to read, because they're both excellent craftsmen of the insult.
I bet. I bet. So let's talk about your perspectives while doing the research and writing the book a little bit. So give us one of those. This is good. I I'm gonna go ahead and do a book on this, because this part's like, what was a time that you went, oh, key piece here?
It was a real slow process, getting this into the form that it ultimately took. So this started out as a spreadsheet on my computer where I was just going to list the books that had been published by Saucerian Books, of which I figured there couldn't be more than a dozen, because I wanted to, track them down on eBay and have a comprehensive collection of Saucerian publications. Mostly because we didn't really talk about this, but they're aesthetically striking books. Barker had a really great design sense and knew how to kind of stretch his budget to put out a really impressive looking product. And so I was just really interested in the books as aesthetic objects, first and foremost. And then the fact that, he was publishing some of the weirdest books of the era because he would pull manuscripts out of his slush pile. And the crackpot folder, and that's a technical term from his archive, uh, and would publish things that no one else would publish. And so I just kind of wanted to have copies of them. But then I thought, oh, well, these are, such interesting aesthetic objects. I'm a librarian and bibliographer. I thought, oh, I'll publish a little zine that'll be a bibliography. And I'll do the full bibliographic description and I'll give what information is available about the author. And I figured that would be, a 30 page zine. But then as I started to really dig into this and saw exactly how much Barker had published, how much information was available about him, about the printing processes he had used, and how he advertised things, the biographies of the authors he was working with. It just kind of grew and grew and grew. But it was for a very long time going to be a bibliography. So I pitched it to the MIT Press, which I got interested in them as a place to publish it because they had put out Eric David's book. Sorry, they had put out Eric Davis's book, High Weirdness, which is about Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson and kind of the weird culture of the 70s. It's got UFOs on the cover. I thought if, I need an academic press that's going to put out a weird book about UFOs, maybe this is the place to look. And
Excuse me, am I
yeah,
correct? That's Eric with a K, right?
yes, it is. Yeah.
Yes, that Eric Davis. Yes.
So they accepted my proposal for a bibliography, but they said, well, maybe consider if you might be able to make this a biography instead. And so I had already signed the contract before this became a biography. So I had made already one trip to the Barker Archive in West Virginia, and my primary focus in that trip was just to see copies of the books, because so many of these are so scarce that I couldn't wait for a copy to turn up on eBay that might get away from me. And so I needed to go to the place that I thought was going to have the most of them. And in fact, there were books in the archive that I still have never seen another copy of. Um, but then I made a second research trip when I was really expanding this into its full book form. And my focus then was, okay, what is here that can make this a life story instead of just a story about the books? And I was pleased to find that there was enough information there to really to tell the story of his life and not just of his career. So yeah, but that was a process that unfolded over more than 10 years. So
Mm,
this has been a kind of very, very slowly growing manuscript on my computer. But that was great because it let me take the time to really absorb a lot of the information to the point where, in the first few letters I looked at, I might not have known, who is this to? What is happening here? And now I can look at a letter that I never seen before from the Barker archive and really have a good sense of where it fits into the bigger story. But it takes
sure.
a long time to get to that point.
Yeah, for it ought to digest it and to start understanding some context and what different terms mean that are inside jokes. And
Nicknames for people is a big one, and dating undated documents is another difficult thing that I've gotten to be pretty good at, for this archive at least.
right, right. Very interesting. What would you like people to take away from the book? What do you think would be what you'd want people to conclude as they read the Saucerian?
Yeah. So for Barker, the main appeal of stories about UFOs is that they are stories. And so I talk a lot in my introduction and elsewhere in the book about The fact that for both myself and for Barker, though I think in different ways, UFOs are a literary phenomenon. It is a phenomenon of stories, storytelling, and story reception. And for Barker, he wanted to create those stories. I'm interested in tracing them to their origins and seeing how they change and mutate over time. Um, so I don't think Barker had a lot of an agenda. I think he really just wanted to keep people engaged and interested and have a lot of fun along the way. I think other people in the UFO world very much do have agendas, but they're using a lot of the same tricks that Barker used. And so I really kind of would like people to take away a bit of a understanding of the tools in Barker's toolbox so that maybe they can see where those same tools are being used elsewhere and maybe not be pulled along by some of those agendas that people have brought to the world of UFOs and the paranormal.
I see. I see. Is there anything you'd like to add that I may not have asked about that you think would be helpful for people to know?
Oh wow! I mean, I could quite literally talk about Gray Barker all day, but no, I think if you have more questions, I'll happily answer more. But no, I don't think I have anything in particular to hammer.
Well, thank you. And I have been speaking with Gabriel Mckee. He is author of The Saucerian from MIT Press. Please visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org and follow our YouTube channel. And we'd appreciate it if you would support our work on Patreon. And where can folks find you, Gabriel?
So you can find me online at gabrielmckee.com. I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram under various variations on Secret Terror or The Secret Terror Among Us. I'll be the UFO one. So the book is available now from the MIT Press. It's called The Saucerian, UFOs, Men in Black, and the Unbelievable Life of Gray Barker. If you are fortunate enough to already have a copy, I would love it if you would review it somewhere. Goodreads, Amazon, or anywhere else is good. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you joining me. And thanks everyone for giving us a watch.